I'm gonna mention several like fundamental ideas in halacha, and then we'll go over sort of the ideology behind the system and how the system works or doesn't work today, and any questions that you have. I don't know if we have questions online, but if we do, somehow we will relay them. So, Jewish law is a distinction primarily between two different categories in two different ways. One is the written law and the oral law, and the other is bein adam lamakom and bein adam l'chaveiro. That is between a person and God and between people and one another. The written law is the Torah. And for a long time after the Torah, as far as we know, and as far as our tradition tells us, the interpretation of the Torah and the legal explanation of the Torah was entirely verbal. And very little, if anything, was written down. And the process of how both the Torah and also what we'll call the oral law, that is mainly the Mishnah and the Gemara, how they were written down, is the subject of tremendous scholarly investigation. And some of it has got to be speculative because, of course, we don't have any accounts of the origin of the writing of those documents that predated the actual Mishnah and following that, the Gemara, by which I mean in about 200 CE, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi gathered together the Mishnayot, the legal writings of a bunch of rabbis, codified them, and gave us the Mishnah, which is one of two parts of the Talmud. There's the Mishnah and the Gemara. But we don't know all the documents that he had. We don't know the documents that he lost, what preceded his writing it. All of that is purely speculative. And so what we do know is that in 200, for whatever reason, around 200, give or take, CE, which means of the Common Era, which means about 2,000 years ago, since we're in 2200 now, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi decided that the oral law, which there were all sorts of prohibitions against writing down, because it was supposed to be a living thing. God wrote the Torah, and then people were supposed to transmit it orally, but for some reason he decided it had to be written down. And people we know had like crib notes. They had this, right? But they didn't have set Mishnayot, set books of law that they would give generation to generation. And the reason most likely that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote it down was because the temple had been destroyed, scholars were scattered, and there was a great fear that people were going to lose all their learning. So he wrote it down, and then the Talmud came along and basically continually refined, discussed, argued with, expanded upon the Mishnah and the Torah. And out of this grew this vast system of Jewish law. Now, Jewish law was a totality, by which I mean it was civil and criminal law. It not only said what the penalty was for stealing, but also what the penalty was for breaking the Shabbos, because there was no distinction really initially. It all came from God, so it was all law. And the distinction that Christianity gave us later between, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, that is, the state gets one thing and the church gets another, was a function of the fact that, remember, Christianity grew up in Rome, and Rome had civil law. So you couldn't have Christian civil law because that was already taken care of by the Roman courts. So you only had Christian religious teachings, not civil teachings. But in Judaism, like in Islam, the law grew up in the desert, where you had to both create a society and also create a religious society. And so one of the things you don't really get in Jewish law is a distinction between religious law and secular or non-religious law. It's all in the codes, which I'll talk about what the codes are in a minute. And at least in theory, although maybe not in practice, but in theory, all law, religious, civil, everything, it's all the same. All comes from God, therefore it's all the same. If your ox gores my ox, what you need to pay is basically religious law too. The laws that are Talmudic, that are rabbinic, have somewhat less weight than laws that are directly from the Torah, as you would expect, even though that is a rule that is not always followed in reality. But in general, the laws of the Torah have greater weight than the laws of the rabbis, because the rabbis derive them from the Torah, whereas the Torah says them explicitly. It is also true that some laws the rabbis sort of eliminate that are in the Torah, not directly, but indirectly, just by interpreting them out of existence. We may come to that later. A division that does exist in Jewish law, unlike religious and civil, is laws between people and laws between people and God. And here too, there's a lot of overlap, but let me give you an example or two of pure, like you're not supposed to wear mixed wool and linen. I was trying to remember what shotn was. There is no English equivalent of it. And that's obviously about that God doesn't want it. It has nothing to do with your relations really with other human beings, unless you're a wool and linen salesman. But giving tzedakah is between people. And most mitzvot imply both. Every mitzvah in some sense implies God, because there are laws between you and God, and then there are laws between you and people. But since God created people, God has a sort of vested interest in how you treat other human beings. But also, the laws that are between you and God usually, in one way or another, often, not usually, but often imply people. Like if you light the Shabbos candles, if you do that in a home, it implies a certain atmosphere that you create. Or if you keep kosher, even though that's God telling you to keep kosher, it has to do with whether you will eat with other Jews, or you create restaurants that Jews could eat at, and so on. So there's almost always a social dimension, even to the laws that are between human beings and God. And then there are laws that we understand, and it's clear what the reason is, and there are laws that are mysterious and we don't understand the reason. So a law like why you have to eat a fish that has fins and scales, not at all clear, right? There are theories, but it is hardly self-evident. Having said all this, the system of law, as it developed, became the sort of distinctive social mode of being Jewish. And those communities that observed Jewish law had much greater cohesion than those that didn't, both because they couldn't assimilate as easily into the surrounding societies. They ate differently. They observed the Sabbath differently. They went to different social institutions, on and on and on. But also because it created a much greater sense of group cohesion among the group themselves. Because when you lead a life that is similar to everybody else's, you have this sense of group cohesion. And most of what modernity was about for Jews was a struggle with the law, even more than with belief. We tend to talk about modernity as beliefs changing, but in the Jewish tradition, the real issue was what you observed and what you didn't observe. because in traditional communities, you could have people who had serious doubts, but as long as they kept Shabbat and they kept kashrut and they davened 3 times a day, it didn't really matter how much they had internal doubts. They were still sort of upstanding members of the community. And to this day, there are many Jews whose the purity of their conviction does not match the purity of their actions. That is, they feel differently from the way they act. And this is a sociological fact that is well known to us, that you can create much greater cohesion with joint action than you can with similar ideas. The modern problem. The other night, I was Saturday night. I was with an Orthodox rabbi, J.J. Schachter, and he and I were speaking to Beth Jacob congregation. It was very interesting because, first of all, it's not usual that you have in front of an Orthodox congregation a conservative and an Orthodox rabbi discussing Jewish ideas and practice. But we were talking about the fact that I mentioned the great change in the modern world ideologically is it used to be that you did something because God told you to. Why don't you eat a cheeseburger? Because God said don't eat a cheeseburger. As soon as the shift was made from God told you to this is good for you, that's the shift to modern Judaism, right? Very few conservative rabbis stand up in front of their congregation and say, keep kosher because God said so. Instead, what they tend to do, not only conservative, modern Orthodox, Reform, so on and so forth, they'll say, pick your mitzvah, whatever it is, because history, because it'll tie you to other Jews, because it'll be good for you. It's important to have a Shabbos day of rest. It renews your soul. It ties you to our tradition, so on. But I don't know of almost any non-really right-wing rabbis that stands up in front of their congregation and says, don't spend money on Shabbos because God said don't. Now, pre-modern Judaism, that was the rationale. The rationale was, I can give you 100 other reasons, and not I am now pre-modern Judaism. Pre-modern Judaism, can give you 100 other reasons too, why God doesn't want you to, but ultimately, even if all those reasons weren't true, you can't do it because God doesn't want you to. Or you must do it because God does want you to. Pick whichever one you like. And once you get to a world in which you have to think of why and choose why, it becomes much harder to justify why. So Rabbi Schachter, who was the other, J.J. Schachter, was the rabbi that I was having the dialogue with, he said that he has, as a modern Orthodox, he teaches at YU, he's a modern Orthodox rabbi, and he has struggled with this same question, of course, as all modern Jews have. He said, and his decision was, I understand as an American, it's really important for me to have choice and to be an autonomous individual. And that's the world in which we live. We really believe very deeply in being autonomous individuals and making choices. He said, so I chose to subject myself to the law. My choice was not to have a choice, but it was my choice. Like in pre-modern Judaism, it didn't seem like a choice. Like, of course, you're subjected to the law. Remember that midrash where God holds the mountain over the Israelites and says, do you want to accept my Torah or should I drop the mountain? And they all go, Torah, please. So he quoted a nice midrash that gives a different frame to that, but still, the element of coercion is real and was real for our ancestors because, you know, if you didn't observe Jewish law, then you were out of the community. And there was no other community that wanted you unless you converted, because every community was a religious community. There wasn't this Benoni, this in-between community that you can be part of now. You were right. You could be a nun but not N-O-N-E. You could be an N-U-N, or there were no nuns, and now there are. So if you weren't in a community, you didn't have much choice about observing Jewish law. Now you have to make a choice to subject yourself to that. You have to be able to say, I'd like to be able to go out on Shabbat, but I can't because I don't do that on Shabbat, which is, everyone understands, a choice to not choose. And the way that this developed over time was, originally there was the Torah, the Talmud, there were various communities, and people realized that you had to make it easier for people to know what to do and what not to do. Remember, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have easy modes of communication. And so starting in the early Middle Ages, people started to write codes of Jewish law, which meant they went through the vast corpus of the Talmud and they distilled it down to the laws that everyone should know. The most famous code until about the 16th century was Maimonides' code, the Mishnah Torah. And Maimonides deliberately didn't include footnotes because it wasn't written for scholars. I mean, now, of course, scholars study it endlessly, but it was written so that the average person could pick it up and say, oh, this is what I do. I'm supposed to do that, right? This is, now you have Google. But then you didn't. And later on, what became then the most famous code post-Maimonides was called the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch was a kind of combined code. What happened was there was a scholar in Poland named Rav Moshe Isserlis who spent his life writing a code of Jewish law, and this is like everyone's nightmare. Just as he's about to publish, he hears that Yosef Karo, who was considered probably the greatest scholar of Jewish law in the world, has just published a code of Jewish law. But he did something very smart. Instead of saying, oh, my life's work is ruined and now I will go into a corner and shrivel up, he took Caro's code and he added glosses, that is like his own commentary, everywhere Caro, who was Sephardic, differed from Isserlis, who was Ashkenazic. So Caro called his code the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, and Isserlis's code is called the Mapah, the tablecloth, right? So he added to it, and now, by the way, there is no such thing as a Shulchan Aruch that is published without Isserlis. They're like, it's considered one book. But yeah, you can imagine, because that's so, because you had the Sephardic world and then the Ashkenazic world, and most of it was the same, but the things that were different were also in there, that until, well, for quite a while held sway in the Jewish world and is still considered authoritative, although to multiply people is to multiply arguments, and there are the last single code that was written that probably had very wide currency was called the Mishnah Brura, and that was written by the Chafetz Chaim, who was a well-known 19th century rabbi, a very famous 19th century rabbi who wrote a lot of books about proper speech, but also wrote this code of Jewish law. And our tie to the Chafetz Chaim is, those of you who were here when Mr. Mermel was here, Mr. Mermel told me when he was very young, he once saw the Chafetz Chaim. So see, Sinai has a direct link to, what he said to me was something very, you know how Moshe asks to see God, and God says, you can't see my face, but you can see my back. And God's like, is moving away, and Moshe sees God's back. So Mr. Mermel told me, I saw the Chafetz Chaim the way Moshe saw the Kodesh Baruch Hu. I was at some place and I saw him walking away. So it was very poetic and lovely. Anyway, if you have not had any firsthand exposure to the enormous, unending corpus of Jewish law and interpretation, you cannot imagine how much of your life it regulates. And when I say from which shoe you put on first in the morning, literally, to how you wash, what you say when you wash your hands, the blessings you say when you go to the bathroom, everything all through the day. And the idea of that, the ideology behind it is that all of life is a continual service of God and God's gift. And so, of course, everything in your life is going to have some kind of um, Jewish legal dimension. There's going to be something that you should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Um, so, and the things that aren't covered by law are covered by minhag, by custom, because there are a lot of customs in Jewish law, in Jewish life, that take the force of law, even though they're not actually legal. But people get very used to doing them, and so they do them just by nature of their own tradition. And sometimes those customs become so powerful that they become law. As an example, not eating beans on Pesach, right? There's a law against chametz, but there's no law against beans. But Ashkenazim didn't eat beans because they didn't have beans. They thought of them as chametz. That custom has the force of law. So that for our traditional Ashkenazi homes, like eating beans or corn, which is obviously not the same as bread, but eating beans or corn is equivalent to eating bread. That's a little bit changing now, only because there's much, much, much more interaction between Sephardic and Ashkenaz, not here as much as in Israel, but here too, there's much more interaction between the two cultures than there ever was before. And the other thing that has a profound effect on Jewish law, although not in very traditional communities, is history. By which I mean, like conservative Judaism used to be known in some circles as positive historical Judaism. What made conservative Judaism different from Orthodoxy was that conservative Judaism grew out of a study of Jewish history. And if you study history, you recognize that everything changes. For example, let me give you an example that I actually just heard the other day. The Cairo Geniza, which is all these documents in Egypt that were buried, that were uncovered much later by Solomon Schechter, largely the first major head of the conservative seminary. But anyway, Cairo Geniza, when they uncovered them, remember, any document that has God's name in it is supposed to go in a Geniza. A Geniza is just a storage house for Jewish documents. So they found this Geniza in the great synagogue in Cairo, had thousands of years of amazing documents in it, including handwritten stuff from Maimonides, so much so that even though it's been 100 years, not everything from the Geniza has been cataloged. But they found Passover ceremonies where there were 2 questions, not 4, where there were 5 questions, not 4. And once you see that, you can do one of 2 things. If you're very traditional, you can say, oh, well, they didn't know the right thing to do. Okay? But if you're a historian, you say, aha, you see, this developed. It didn't come down from Sinai that you have to ask 4 questions. Some communities had 2 questions, some communities had 5 questions. Once printing came into the world, the printers decided 4 questions, or whoever gave it to the printers decided 4, and it became standardized that everybody asked 4 questions. But once you open that door and you know that law develops, then it becomes really hard to see it as you have to do this solely because it was given to you at Sinai. And so history sort of contaminates your assumptions about almost everything. I mean, look, you see this in a different way playing out in America right now. When I grew up, just to take an easy one, let's take an easy one, okay? When I grew up, no one gave a thought to Native Americans. Nobody said, by the way, there used to be lots and lots and lots of people until like Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which sort of broke the public consciousness on this. I don't remember what year it was published. Sometime I think in the 70s. But you could Google that and find out. But anyway, by D. Brown, I think was the name of the author. And that like burst on the public consciousness in a powerful way. But who were the Indians? First of all, they were not called Native Americans. They were called Indians. The Indians were, as far as we knew, the bad guys in movies. That's except for Tonto. Tonto was good, right? But that was basically, that really was the public consciousness. But once you start to study history, it's no longer so easy to make the same assumptions about the world that you're in as it was before, and in a very different way, but the process being the same. Once you start to study Jewish history, it impugns the authority of certain Jewish practices and ideas, and you can no longer see them. You can no longer see Judaism as skating on the ice of history, as though history doesn't affect it at all. Now, the extent to which it affects it and the extent to which Judaism is eternal and God-given, this is a huge, obviously, theological argument and debate and discussion. But especially in the realm of law, you see how profound this is. So when you see Hasidim wear long black coats, that was the dress of Polish noblemen in the 1800s, in the 18th century. And before then, no Jew wore long black coats. Maimonides wound his turban around his head every morning. And there are histories. The kippah has a very interesting history. In the Talmud, people didn't wear kippot. In the Middle Ages, a lot of people didn't wear kippot. German Jewry, even the most traditional German Jewry, put a kippah on their head when they said a blessing, take it off when the blessing was over, and spend most of the day without a kippah on your head, even if you were traditional. That has changed in the modern world, obviously. A kippah is like a signal of I'm a traditional Jew, although it didn't used to be. So on and on and on, there are all these manifestations of law that have changed, and yet the essential two characteristics of Jewish law, and maybe with this I will, I want to say one more kind, and then the two characteristics of Jewish law that I want to get to are one, that it is in some way a reaction to God's word, and two, that it marks Jews as distinct. Those two things are common to every system of Jewish law that is a system of Jewish law. And the one other, I mentioned codes, but I didn't mention tshuvot, which are also really important. Tshuvot are answers, literally it means answers, and those are questions that people would ask rabbis. Still do. And the rabbis would answer, and especially if you were a posek, which means a decider, basically, you would answer sometimes with very full answers and lots of sources. And the posek that you followed depended on which community you were a part of. The most famous modern posek, there are a number of famous ones, but the most famous one was Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he was effectively, for the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community, he was, for more than anyone else. All Jews never follow any one person. But he was, more than anyone else, the person who decided Jewish law in the 20th century. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop for a minute and take questions, comments, yeah, Bob. Which shoe? Depends. Are you a leftist or a rightist? Yeah. How did say it again? Oh, because in the Jewish world, don't forget, people traveled all the time. Jews were merchants. They went from community to community, and word spread very quickly about major works. So it is true that, I mean, now we're talking about the 15th, 16th century. It is true that Rashi wasn't known to Maimonides. And they lived at about the same time. Rashi was the most famous biblical commentator. He lived, I think, 1040 to 1105. Maimonides lived 1135 to 1204. Okay, so Maimonides was born about 30 years after Rashi died. As far as we know, Rashi was not known to Maimonides, even though he lived at about the same time. Maimonides lived in Fostat in Cairo. Rashi lived in France, in Troyes in France. At the time, though, Maimonides' world was much more sophisticated. The Arab world was infinitely more sophisticated than the Christian world in the Middle Ages. Those were the Dark Ages for Christians, and philosophy was written in Arabic, and the Arab world is the ones that preserved the Greeks. But by the time of Caro was part of the generation that got expelled from Spain. He lived in Sfat. You can still see his grave, by the way, in Sfat, if you want to go and see the grave of Yosef Caro, and a lot of other famous mystics. And Isserlis lived in Poland. So I guess there was a lot of, from the Holy Land to Poland was a very different trade route, source of discussion. I wonder if we know exactly. That would be interesting. I don't know that story, but it would be interesting to know if we know exactly how Isserlis found out about Caro. You know how to find out as easily as I do. Did Isserlis find out? Yeah, anyway. Yeah.
Two questions. If we put yourself in a time machine and roll back to biblical Israel, was Hebrew or Aramaic the conversation of the day? I'd like to buy a horse from you. I'd like to marry your daughter. What would have been
in the Bible, it was Hebrew. Later on, it was Aramaic because of Babylonia, because Babylonia was the ruling power.
so around 500 BC?
Probably the first books that are written in Aramaic in the Bible are the Book of Daniel, which is about 400 or 500, a little later. Yeah.
Jews around the year 0 would have spoken Aramaic.
Oh yeah. Let me put it this way. I know this is a strange way to put it, but it's Jesus' native tongue was Aramaic, wasn't Hebrew. And that was true for most Jews at that time. Hillel and Shammai probably spoke, since they were deeply, Jews from the north, they probably spoke Hebrew and Aramaic. They probably spoke both.
Hebrew would have ceased being a civil language already by 400 or 500 BC.
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say that definitively. I'd be interested, but I think that it was Aramaic was if you should forgive the phrase, lingua franca of the time. Exactly. Yep. Of everyday life. Yes. Yep.
And second question, does Jewish law have an opinion about non-Jews living within the Jewish community, whether there's a compulsion or not a compulsion to follow Jewish law?
Oh, many opinions about it. Sure. We have lots of opinions about non-Jews. There's something called the 7 laws of Noah. And those are the laws that non-Jews are mandated by the Torah to follow. They're basically the 10 Commandments without the specifically Jewish ones. But they include things like set up a system of courts. In other words, be a civil society. Non-Jews, one of the things that we don't realize, and actually I'll tell you what book really brought this up. I always knew that the non-Jewish world and the Jewish world had a lot of interaction, more than we think, because you can't be completely self-sustaining in most of, and when you live in someone else's society, right? The currency, the courts, the so on. So I read Elisheva Baumgarten many years, I don't know how many years ago. I reviewed her book about the family in the Middle Ages for I think for the Jewish Spectator, which doesn't exist anymore. And she wrote how these rabbis gave tshuvot about employing a wet nurse on Shabbat, a non-Jewish wet nurse. And I thought, if you know the non-Jewish community well enough to know who just gave birth and could be a wet nurse for your child, you had to be very close in a way that I didn't really fully appreciate. So now there were periods of particular hostility. Let me tell you a really beautiful story. It starts off not so beautiful, but it ends up beautiful. So Eliezer Shlomovich, who taught at the UJ and grew up in Slotvina, which changed borders. I mean, depends what country it was, depends on what week it was. He told me when he grew up, you were taught when you drove by a church, you spit, because they all hate you and they all want to kill you, and that's just the way it is, okay? And that was the relationship that he learned with. So he survived the labor camp. I don't believe he was ever in a concentration camp. He survives the labor camp, comes to LA, and he's teaching Midrash. Incredibly learned man. He's teaching Midrash at the University of Judaism, now AJU, but then the University of Judaism in LA. Dr. Lieber, who was a rabbi here and was the president of the, said to him, there's an interfaith conference at Berkeley, and I'd like you to go. Christian Jewish was interfaith. Muslims had not been invented yet in America. Again, something else that was not in the consciousness of most Americans before, I don't know, 20 years ago. So he said, no, I don't go to an interfaith conference and sit with a bunch of Christians who all want to hate you. And Dr. Lieber said, no, you don't, I'm not asking you. I need you to go to the interfaith. So he goes to the interfaith conference. They open with a meal. The guy, the Christian minister who began the meal said, I would like to begin this meal the way our Lord Jesus would have begun the meal. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. And Eliezer says he started to cry. He couldn't believe that a Christian would acknowledge Jesus's Judaism, would say a Hebrew blessing, and that was when he realized America was different from the world that he came from. So yeah, Jews had a lot of opinions about the non-Jewish world, and it changed a lot. I mean, there were times, for example, the Golden Age of Spain, when Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all of them, actually really did very well with each other. So it's not impossible. It can be done. It just... Right. Yes. I mean, right. Exactly. They suspect them of other motivations. And my feeling is, like, I don't really care what you think will happen to me after I die. I really don't. If you treat me well while I'm alive, Martin Buber used to have a really nice phrase about that. He said, someone asked him whether he expected the second coming of Jesus. And he said, listen, Martin Buber, who is a Jewish theologian, right? He said, listen, this is what I think. He said, when the Messiah comes, whoever the Messiah is, he said, we will say to him, have you been here before? He said, and if the Messiah is as smart as I think he is, he'll go, you know, I don't remember. So I mean, it's like, I don't have a problem with that. I really don't. If someone treats me well, they can theologically think what will happen to me. The problem is that one often leaks into the other. It's really hard to believe that somebody's condemned to hell because they reject the Savior and still treat them as nicely as you treat people who you think haven't. But that's a discussion for another time. So other Jewish law, Jewish history, Jewish, non-Jewish questions. Anything online? No. Yes. They struggle with it. In fact, one of the things that the modern Orthodox community is really having a hard time with now is the position of women. And they're really grappling with it because they live in a society in which women can do everything that men can do except be rabbis. And that's really hard. And so I write an ethics column for Sapir, with a wonderful and extremely learned woman named Yafa Epstein. I'm called Rabbi Wolpe, and she's called Rabba Epstein. Now, she says she's okay with that, and she expects in time that will change also. I think she expects it'll change. I don't want to speak for her. But there is no reason necessarily why that has to be the case, except that the more you see the system as a divine system and the less you see it as a humanly developing system, the more you're likely to keep things the way they are and be less willing to change them. So it's hard. It's hard on all sorts of fronts because society makes more and more insistent. 50 years ago, it wasn't hard. But here, uh, the other thing that makes this hard, I think, is there is a huge anti-institutional bias among young people in particular. So every institution, media, courts, clergy, all of them have less respect than they did 50 years ago. My theory about why that is, people say because they failed, because they are not as good as they were. I don't think any of that's true. I think it has to do entirely with transparency, by which I mean they were always messed up. You think 50 years ago the police weren't brutal and people didn't know about it? Or 100 years ago the courts weren't biased? But you didn't have the same transparency that you do now. Now that you can see inside all these institutions and you see, oh my God, they're actually staffed by people who are people just like me. And I know how messed up I am. So they lose a certain amount of authority. And that makes holding this religious authority more problematic, because now people know that the imams and the rabbis and the priests are human just like they are, and sometimes worse, right? That's Cervantes says that in Don Quixote. Everybody is as God made him and often worse. So as a result, I think the reactionary hold that you see is because here are people who don't want to give up power, and they see their power slipping away because people don't respect them the same way anymore. It's a very different world. And in that world, it's harder to keep consistent standards than it once was. It's just harder. I don't know where that'll come out. Yeah.
I know that you debated a lot with Christians. You always had the phrase cafeteria Catholicism. I'll take some of this,
Yes.
some of that.
Yep. I'm totally in favor of it. I'm totally in favor of cafeteria religion.
His comment was always, I have to take the entire thing, including.
Yeah, of course he would say that, because then he could attack it more easily. But I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's ever been true. The Judaism of Moses is not the same as the Judaism of Maimonides. Is not the same as the Judaism of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So I think that that religions are developing systems, and if you're going to argue religion with someone, if you want to argue with that person, you have to argue what they believe. You can't argue what other people who associate themselves with it believe. But that's my, so, yeah. Okay. No, not at all. I was actually just folding this up. So Sarah asked why did Karaite Jews choose not to follow rabbinic law, and why aren't they around anymore? I think there are a very, very small number. There are a few Karaite Jews left, but negligible. So even the rabbis recognized that they added a lot of stuff to the Torah, right? They spoke about the laws of Shabbat and the laws of Kashrut as mountains hanging by a hair, because they would take one biblical verse like, you shall not see the lamb in its mother's milk. It's repeated 3 times in the Torah, but that's the only thing the Torah says about not mixing meat and milk. The Torah does not say, therefore you shall have separate dishwashers. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say, therefore you cannot have a cheeseburger. All it says is, don't see the lamb in its mother's milk. And the rabbis come along and they make it huge. That's one of the reasons why it is a rabbinic doctrine that everything that a student will later say was given to Moses at Sinai, because they always try to trace back what they say to Sinai to give it more legitimacy. But you are entitled to suspect that they added some stuff. So the Karaites come along and say, I don't buy this. And we actually know much more about the Karaites now than we did 100 years ago, because a lot of their writings have been translated and published. And what happened was that the Karaites rejected rabbinic law, tried to live exclusively by the Torah, but invariably they had to develop their own interpretations as well, because some things the Torah just doesn't spell out for you. It just doesn't. It says you can't do malacha on Shabbat, and it doesn't tell you what malacha is. So for whatever reasons, probably because the rabbinic system was more flexible, rabbinic Judaism won, which is another thing. Like if you went back to point A, or like Sadia Gaon, who was the first great, second, because the first was Philo, who was the first great rabbinic philosopher of Judaism in the 800s. He spent a lot of his life fighting against the Karaites. And the reason he did was because it was not at all clear that the Rabbinites were going to win against the Karaites, but they did. Like a lot of historical struggles, there were probably many reasons, but I think it mostly was because the rabbinical system was very flexible and allowed people to live. Like if you interpret the Torah, you give it more possibilities of changing it when you need to. And that's how the rabbis basically, that's how they created like economic systems, was by interpreting the Torah in such a way that people were allowed to have a decent economic life and so on. But the same thing, I think the same thing, there were other groups too, the Samaritans. The reason why you have the Good Samaritan in the New Testament is because the Samaritans were opponents of the Rabbinites. And it was like a shtoch, I don't know what the right English word that is, like a twist of the knife to the Jews to say, look, this Samaritan is the good one, right? So it's very interesting how these events of a moment become frozen forever, and they become the story forever and ever and ever. So like when we grew up, like the British were bad because they tried to keep America, and all the Americans were good. But at the time, there were decent arguments on both sides. But we won. So the winners get to write history. That's why it's good to win.
I wasn't here today because I was going to do a tour at the Holocaust Museum that got canceled. I always ask whether if there, I have most of the students, middle school, high school students, rarely Jewish groups. I always ask how many Christians, how many Catholics,
Right.
any other religions, and the vast majority raise their hand for nothing.
Really?
So nuns, this is anecdotal, every time. I may have 2 or 3 or 4 out of 20 identify with any religion.
Interesting.
And I'm a connoisseur of cafeteria Judaism by far.
Right.
And I know that the best parts of me are those things that I have selected from Judaism and lived by. So I'm really worried about the future of nothing. And certainly it's a problem within our own community. And I wonder if you think, I know you don't look at the future, but do you think that we're going to revert at some point to more religion as has happened in history? Or what do you think?
Hope so. Big discussion. I'm going to save it for another time because that's a huge discussion. We'll see. We will see. The one thing that I would say is that I don't know yet, and I don't think they know yet, what none will mean. So we'll see. I don't know if none means none. None might mean more than anything else, not what I was raised with. But other alternatives may not have presented themselves in their lives. But anyway, I'll leave that for the moment. We'll see. Other questions about anything we covered today? Going once. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. She said back in the day when Mr. Mermel ran the Daily Minion, it had to be 10 men. Go ahead. Right. 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 Well, I mean, the conservative movement has absolutely been more flexible, and obviously, Mr. Mermel did not come from a conservative background. I mean, now there are more women in rabbinical school in the conservative movement than there are men, but the modern Orthodox movement looks at the conservative movement as a cautionary tale, not as a tale of, if only we could be like them. And this is an interesting sociological phenomenon that I am not qualified to pronounce on. Doesn't mean I won't, but I'm not qualified to. Which is that when women go into a profession, very often what seems to happen is men abandon it. And one of the things that I will hear from my Orthodox friends is, okay, so you let women in the minyan. Do you have a minyan every morning? Because we don't let women in the minyan, and we have a minyan every morning and every afternoon, every evening with no problem. And so from my point of view, it's an issue of justice, and I'm grateful for it. And as I've said before, I won't tell you the whole story, but my father hired the first woman that was ordained as a conservative rabbi. So I come from that tradition, but in the Orthodox world, they're worried. They're worried that that step will not contribute to the overall health of the community. And all I can say is we'll see. We will see. There are lots of factors. The other factor that is very significant in the conservative movement is the most famous legal decision that the conservative movement ever made was the driving tshuva. It was a huge thing at the time, not so much now, which was to allow conservative Jews to drive to synagogue. And the people who voted for it said basically they were just recognizing a reality. But the tshuva says you can only drive to synagogue. Can't drive anywhere else. And I grew up in a home in which on rare occasions my father would drive to synagogue, but he would never drive anywhere else, wouldn't think of driving anywhere else. And you can see how with all the best intentions in the world, it's really hard to open a gate a little bit. It's just hard to do that. And I understand the inclination of those who don't want to open the gate at all, because once you open it, it tends to swing open at the next breeze. And I would say the number of people in this congregation who don't drive on Shabbat is reasonably small. Reasonably small. And that's, but you can argue it both ways. The other thing that you can argue is that because these are people who would do that anyway? Or is it because the conservative movement gave them permission to do it, so they do it? I don't know the answer to that. And I also don't know what forms of Judaism, given how much the world is changing, I don't know what forms of Judaism will have to be created or recreated in order to speak to people who aren't spoken to by, look, I find it difficult to think that most 20-year-olds would walk into the sanctuary at Sinai and see the fixed pews and the big ceiling and the stained glass windows and go, this is my spiritual home. Because it spoke to one generation very powerfully, but I'm not sure that it speaks to an anti-institutional, outdoor, guitar-playing, sunset-watching generation the same way. So things change, and a living religion has to change with them. And that's why we are streaming this class. Thank you very much. Are we off? Chris, are we off?